Have you ever felt betrayed, wronged, or hopeless? Joseph experienced all of this. Sold into slavery by his own brothers and unjustly thrown into prison. Yet, even in the worst circumstances, he never lost faith in God's purpose. In this story, you will discover how Joseph's perseverance and forgiveness took him from the depths of a prison to the heights of power as the governor of Egypt. If you are facing difficulties and seeking to understand God's plan for your life, this story will renew your hope and faith. Joseph was the most beloved son of Jacob, also known as Israel. Jacob had 12 sons, but Joseph held a special place in his heart. He was the firstborn of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, who had been barren for many years. Perhaps because of this, or because Joseph was born when Jacob was older, he had a special affection for this son. To show how much he loved him, Jacob made Joseph a special coat, full of vibrant colors and high-quality fabrics. This coat was not just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of favoritism and honor. While Joseph's brothers wore simple work clothes, he walked around in that colorful coat, which attracted attention wherever he went. Joseph's brothers began to feel jealous. They saw how their father treated him, as if Joseph was more important than they were. And, as often happens when jealousy takes root, it began to turn into something darker: resentment and hatred. Without even realizing it, Joseph seemed to make things worse. He was young, only 17 years old, and still did not fully understand how his words and actions could affect others. He openly shared everything he thought and dreamed, including 2 prophetic dreams that made him seem even more arrogant in his brothers' eyes. One night, Joseph had a dream that disturbed him, but also filled him with curiosity. The next day, he could hardly wait to tell his brothers what he had dreamed. They were all gathered together, and Joseph enthusiastically began to narrate. "Listen to the dream I had. We were in the field, tying bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood upright, and your bundles gathered around and bowed down to mine." Joseph's brothers listened in silence, but inside, their indignation was boiling. To them, this dream was yet another sign of Joseph's arrogance. How could he suggest that one day he would become greater than they were? For the youngest to place himself above the eldest was an affront in that culture. The brothers, already resentful of Jacob's favoritism, felt their jealousy grow even stronger. But it didn't stop there. Shortly after, Joseph had another dream. This time, he saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down before him. The meaning was clear. The sun represented his father, the moon his mother, and the stars his brothers. Joseph, not realizing how provocative this seemed, shared the dream again with his brothers and also with his father. This time, even Jacob, who loved Joseph so much, was uncomfortable with what he heard. "What kind of dream is this that you had? Will your mother, your brothers, and I actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Jacob asked, trying to bring Joseph back to reality. But deep down, Jacob kept these words in his heart. He knew that Joseph had something special, something God was revealing. Meanwhile, Joseph's brothers could no longer contain their hatred. To them, Joseph was not just their father's favorite, but someone who saw himself as superior to everyone. Each dream was a painful reminder that Joseph saw himself as their leader, someone they would one day bow down to. That colorful coat, the grand dreams, and Joseph's confident attitude became unbearable. Something had to be done to stop Joseph and erase those dreams that tormented them so much. Joseph still didn't know it, but his dreams were a glimpse of the divine plan. A plan that would take him down paths he could never have imagined, where his faith would be tested, but where he would see God's purposes fulfilled in an extraordinary way. But before those dreams could be realized, Joseph would face what seemed to be the end of all his hopes. The resentment of Joseph's brothers had turned into hatred. To them, Joseph was no longer a brother, but an obstacle, a problem that needed to be solved. The opportunity for this came when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, who were tending the flocks far from home. Joseph, always obedient to his father, left without suspecting anything. He found them in Dothan, an isolated region, far from the watchful eyes of Jacob. When the brothers saw him approaching, that colorful coat fluttering in the wind, their hearts hardened even more. "Here comes the dreamer," they said to each other. To them, this was the perfect moment to put an end to Joseph's dreams once and for all. The plan was sinister. Kill Joseph and throw his body into an empty pit. Then they would tell their father that a wild animal had devoured him. That way, they would forever end his dreams of greatness. But even in the midst of their wickedness, there was a moment of hesitation. Reuben, the oldest of the brothers, did not want to see his brother's blood spilled. He suggested that they simply throw him into the pit without harming him, with the intention of rescuing him later and returning him to their father. The brothers agreed. When Joseph arrived, unsuspecting, he was seized by force. His words of surprise and fear were not enough to soften his brothers' hardened hearts. They tore off his colorful coat, the symbol of Jacob's favoritism, and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, without water, but for Joseph, it was a place of despair, a hole with no way out. While Joseph cried out for help, his brothers sat down to eat. They felt relieved, thinking they had finally solved the problem once and for all. But fate had other plans. Suddenly, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants coming from the desert, heading toward Egypt. Judah, one of the brothers, had a different idea. "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The other brothers agreed. They pulled Joseph out of the pit, but now his fate was different. Instead of being killed, he was sold as a slave for 20 pieces of silver. 20 pieces that, at that moment, seemed like a fair price to rid themselves of someone they hated so much. The merchants took him to Egypt, a distant and unfamiliar land, where Joseph would be sold as a mere object. After selling Joseph as a slave, the brothers needed to come up with a convincing story to justify his absence. They knew that their father, Jacob, was deeply attached to Joseph, and that any explanation for the disappearance of his favorite son would have to be very convincing. They couldn't simply say that Joseph had vanished. They needed proof that confirmed an irreversible tragedy. So, they decided to use the symbol that most represented Jacob's affection for Joseph, the coat of many colors. That tunic, which had been a special gift from Jacob to Joseph, would now be used to deceive their own father. They killed a young goat and dipped the tunic in the animal's blood, making it appear as though Joseph had been attacked by a wild beast. The irony was cruel. The same gift that symbolized Jacob's love would now be the vehicle for the deepest pain he would ever feel. With the blood-stained tunic in hand, the brothers returned home. When they arrived, they pretended surprise and concern. They showed the tunic to Jacob and said, "We found this. See if it is not your son's tunic." It wasn't just a question. It was a sentence. Jacob immediately recognized the garment he had lovingly given to Joseph. Seeing the blood-stained tunic, Jacob felt his heart stop. He didn't need to hear anything else. The sight of that tunic soaked in blood told him the whole story his sons wanted him to believe. A wild beast has devoured him. Surely Joseph has been torn to pieces. Jacob cried out, overcome with despair and grief. The man who had wrestled with God, who had been blessed with 12 sons, was now destroyed inside. The pain was unbearable. Jacob tore his clothes in mourning, a common practice in that culture to express the depth of sorrow. He dressed in sackcloth, a rough and uncomfortable fabric used in times of great suffering. For days, he refused to be comforted, not even by his other sons. To him, Joseph was dead, and with him, a part of Jacob's own soul had also died. Jacob said, "I will go down to the grave mourning for my son." The loss of Joseph consumed him to such an extent that it seemed as though his own life had lost its meaning. While Jacob mourned the supposed death of Joseph, the young man, now sold into slavery, was being taken to a distant land, Egypt. Imagine Joseph's shock and despair as he found himself in chains, separated from his family, and taken to a foreign country where he didn't know the language, the customs, or the people. He was just a 17-year-old boy, brutally torn from his home and his loving father. But even in that desperate situation, God was with him. Upon arriving in Egypt, Joseph was sold as a slave to Potiphar, a high-ranking official of Pharaoh. the captain of the guard. Potiphar was a powerful man, and Joseph, even in his condition as a slave, began to show his worth. Although he was in a strange land and in a position of complete submission, Joseph never stopped trusting in God. He knew that somehow God had a plan, even if he couldn't understand it at that moment. Over time, Potiphar noticed that everything Joseph touched prospered. Joseph was a dedicated, honest, and highly competent worker. Potiphar soon saw that the Lord was with Joseph and that he gave him success in everything he did. Impressed, Potiphar appointed Joseph as his personal assistant and put him in charge of managing his entire household. Joseph went from being an ordinary slave to the administrator of one of the most important households in Egypt. Potiphar trusted Joseph so much that he did not concern himself with anything except what he would eat. Despite being a foreigner and a slave, Joseph had earned a position of great responsibility and respect in Potiphar's house. His integrity, hard work, and trust in God had elevated him to the administrator of all that his master owned. But amid his success, a great test of character arose that would challenge his faithfulness to God and the principles he believed in. Potiphar's wife, noticing Joseph's good looks and his closeness to Potiphar, began to desire him. Day after day, she tried to seduce Joseph, making increasingly direct advances. However, Joseph, knowing that it was wrong in God's eyes and a betrayal of his master, always refused. He said to her, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" These words showed that, for Joseph, sin was not just an offense against Potiphar but, above all, an offense against God, whom he served faithfully. But Potiphar's wife did not give up. One day, when all the other servants were out, she found Joseph alone in the house and grabbed his garment, insisting that he lie with her. Joseph, in an act of courage and determination, broke free and fled, leaving his cloak in her hands. He knew he needed to escape the situation at any cost because his loyalty to God was more important than anything else. However, Joseph's rejection enraged Potiphar's wife. Feeling humiliated and determined to take revenge, she cried out for help, calling the household servants and inventing a devastating lie. When Potiphar returned home, she falsely accused Joseph of trying to assault her. Showing Joseph's cloak as evidence, she said, "The Hebrew slave you brought here tried to make sport of me, but I screamed, and he ran out, leaving his cloak behind." Potiphar, upon hearing his wife's accusations, was furious. Although he knew Joseph was a just and upright man, he felt pressured to act. After all, it was his wife's word against that of a slave. Thus, Joseph, who had been faithful, honest, and loyal, was thrown into prison, accused of a crime he did not commit. After being unjustly accused and thrown into prison, Joseph could have easily succumbed to despair. He had been faithful to God, resisted temptation, and done what was right. But instead of being rewarded, he now found himself in a cold, dark cell, treated like a criminal. Anyone might have thought his story would end there, but Joseph knew that God was with him, even in prison. He did not allow bitterness to take root in his heart. In prison, Joseph soon stood out, just as he had in Potiphar's house. The chief jailer quickly noticed that Joseph was different. He was trustworthy, wise, and, above all, had an inner peace that was hard to find. This peace came from his unwavering faith in God. Even in the darkness of the prison, Joseph continued to trust that God had a plan, even if he didn't understand what was happening at the time. The Lord was with Joseph and made him prosper, even in those conditions. Soon, the chief jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners and everything that was done there. Once again, Joseph was placed in a position of authority, even in the most adverse circumstances. The jailer trusted Joseph so much that he did not supervise anything under Joseph's care because he saw that the Lord was with him and that everything he did prospered. While Joseph was managing the prison, 2 new prisoners were brought in. They were none other than Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, both accused of offending the king of Egypt. These men, once powerful and close to Pharaoh, now found themselves in the same prison as Joseph. One day, both had disturbing dreams they could not understand. The next morning, noticing that they were troubled, Joseph asked, "Why do you look so sad today?" The men explained to Joseph that they had dreams but had no one to interpret them. Joseph, full of confidence in God, said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer was the first to share his dream. He dreamed of a vine before him with 3 branches. The branches budded, the grapes ripened, and he squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interpreted the dream. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position, and you will place the cup in Pharaoh's hand, just as you used to do. Then Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored to his position and to mention his case to Pharaoh so that he might be released from prison. Encouraged by the positive interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, the baker also told his dream to Joseph. He dreamed that he had 3 baskets of bread on his head, and in the top basket were baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket. Joseph, with sadness, interpreted the dream. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will hang you, and the birds will eat your flesh. 3 days later, the dreams came true exactly as Joseph had interpreted. The cupbearer was restored to his position, but unfortunately, the baker was hanged. However, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. Even after being freed, he did not mention Joseph to Pharaoh, and Joseph remained in prison, forgotten. 2 long years passed after Joseph interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. During this time, Joseph remained in prison, seemingly forgotten by everyone, but not by God. The cupbearer, who had promised to remember Joseph when he was restored to his position, continued with his life in Pharaoh's palace and left Joseph behind. For Joseph, those 2 years in prison must have been a severe test of patience and faith. He had done good, been faithful, but was still imprisoned. It could have been easy to fall into despair, but Joseph continued to trust that God had a purpose, even in those moments of silence and waiting. Then, something unexpected happened. Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in Egypt, had 2 strange and troubling dreams on the same night. In the first dream, he saw 7 fat and healthy cows come up out of the Nile, followed by 7 thin and ugly cows that devoured the fat cows. In the second dream, he saw 7 full and good ears of grain, which were then swallowed by 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind. These dreams deeply disturbed Pharaoh, but no one in his palace, neither magicians nor wise men, could interpret them. It was then that the cupbearer, who served Pharaoh every day, finally remembered Joseph. He said to Pharaoh, "Today I remember my faults. When Pharaoh was angry with me and the chief baker, we both had dreams in prison, and a young Hebrew, a servant of the captain of the guard, interpreted our dreams. And everything happened just as he said." The cupbearer finally brought up Joseph's name, the man he had forgotten, but who had the answer Pharaoh so desperately needed. Immediately, Pharaoh sent for Joseph. After 2 years in prison, Joseph was quickly brought before the king of Egypt. Before presenting himself to Pharaoh, Joseph shaved and changed his clothes, knowing that he was facing a unique opportunity. When he arrived at the palace, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph, with humility and confidence in God, replied, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Joseph knew that his ability to interpret dreams did not come from himself but from God, and he did not hesitate to give God all the glory. Pharaoh recounted his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph, with the wisdom given by God, interpreted them accurately. He explained that the 2 dreams were one. God was revealing to Pharaoh what was about to happen. The 7 years of fat cows and good ears represented 7 years of great abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine so severe that all the abundance would be forgotten. Joseph advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to store provisions during the years of plenty so that Egypt could survive the coming famine. After hearing the interpretation of the dreams and Joseph's wise counsel, Pharaoh was deeply impressed. He recognized that Joseph's wisdom was not ordinary but came directly from God. The clarity and insight with which Joseph explained the meaning of the dreams showed Pharaoh that this young Hebrew was not just another prisoner but someone with a divine gift. Pharaoh turned to his advisors and said, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" In the presence of everyone in the palace, Pharaoh declared to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Thus, in a moment, Joseph was elevated from prisoner to governor of Egypt, the second most powerful man in the country. Pharaoh gave Joseph his signet ring, a symbol of authority, dressed him in fine linen robes, and placed a gold chain around his neck. Joseph was driven in a chariot across the land of Egypt, and the people bowed before him. Pharaoh also gave Joseph a new name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and married him to Asenath, the daughter of a prominent priest, further solidifying his position in Egyptian society. The responsibility that Joseph took on was immense. He was not only governing Egypt but also had the vital task of preparing the nation for the years of famine to come. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, overseeing the collection of vast amounts of grain and storing everything in the cities. He ensured that each city was well prepared, with sufficient provisions to face what was ahead. Joseph's plan was so efficient that Egypt accumulated an extraordinary amount of grain, like the sand of the sea. There was so much that Joseph stopped keeping records because the quantities were beyond measure. Meanwhile, God continued to bless Joseph, who had 2 sons with Asenath. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The second he named Ephraim, saying, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." The 7 years of abundance passed, and just as Joseph had predicted, the 7 years of famine began. The drought spread across all the lands, causing scarcity and suffering. There were no harvests, and food supplies quickly dwindled. The famine affected not only Egypt but all the surrounding regions as well. However, thanks to Joseph's wisdom and preparation, Egypt was ready. The full granaries Joseph had built during the years of abundance now became the salvation of the entire nation. As the famine intensified, people throughout Egypt began to cry out for food. Pharaoh told the people, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." With the authority given to him, Joseph began to open the storehouses and sell grain to the Egyptians. The news that there was food in Egypt spread quickly, and people from other nations began to travel there in search of food. Egypt became the center of provision for the known world at that time, and Joseph was in charge of this monumental operation. Meanwhile, in the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his sons lived, the famine was also felt. Jacob, who still mourned the loss of Joseph, heard that there was grain in Egypt. Desperate to save his family from starvation, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." Joseph's 10 older brothers, the ones who had sold him into slavery years before, set out for Egypt. Benjamin, the youngest brother, stayed with Jacob, as their father feared that something bad might happen to him, just as it had to Joseph. The brothers traveled to Egypt, unaware of what was to come. When they arrived, they found themselves before the governor, the man responsible for distributing food. They did not know it, but that powerful man was Joseph, their brother, now transformed and almost unrecognizable. Joseph, now the governor of Egypt, stood before his brothers, the very ones who had betrayed and sold him into slavery many years before. To them, Joseph was just a powerful Egyptian official, dressed in noble garments, speaking in a language they did not understand. Little did they know that the man before whom they bowed seeking food was the brother they had abandoned. Joseph, for his part, felt a mix of emotions upon seeing them. On the one hand, they were his blood, his family. On the other, they were responsible for all the suffering he had endured. But Joseph knew that God had a purpose in all of it. He decided to keep his identity hidden for a time, not out of revenge, but to test his brothers and see if they had changed. Joseph accused them of being spies, a serious charge that filled them with fear. Desperate to prove their innocence, the brothers explained that they were 12 sons of one man in Canaan, that one was dead, and the youngest, Benjamin, had stayed with their father. Hearing this, Joseph was overwhelmed with emotion. They still remembered him, but they believed he was dead. Determined to test them, Joseph said, "If you are honest men, leave one of your brothers here with me while the rest of you go and take grain back to your starving families. Bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and you may not die." The brothers agreed, but deep down they felt guilty. They began to speak among themselves, recalling what they had done to Joseph years before. "We are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben, the eldest, rebuked them, saying, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand every word, as he was using an interpreter to speak with them. Hearing this, Joseph could not hold back his tears and withdrew for a moment to weep. His heart was heavy with a mixture of pain and compassion. When he returned, Joseph ordered that Simeon be taken and bound before their eyes, and that the other brothers return to Canaan with the grain. But he also gave a secret command to his servants, to return the money they had brought, placing it in their grain sacks. The brothers departed, unaware of the money, worried about Simeon's fate and the difficult task of convincing their father to let Benjamin return with them to Egypt. When they arrived home, they told Jacob everything, and he was devastated. "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Jacob could not bear the thought of losing another son, especially Benjamin, the only other son of Rachel, his beloved wife. Despite his son's pleas, Jacob refused to let Benjamin go. Time passed, and the famine worsened. Finally, when their provisions ran out, Jacob, in desperation, relented. Judah, who pledged to protect Benjamin with his own life, took his younger brother and returned to Egypt, as Joseph had demanded. When Joseph's brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, the youngest brother, they were apprehensive. They knew their lives depended on convincing the Egyptian governor of their innocence. Joseph, still disguised as an Egyptian noble, saw them approaching, and when he spotted Benjamin, his heart filled with emotion. Benjamin was the only brother who had not participated in his betrayal, and seeing him now, grown and safe, brought tears to Joseph's eyes. However, he was not yet ready to reveal himself. There was one more test he needed to apply. Joseph ordered a special meal to be prepared for his brothers. When they were brought to Joseph's house, they were terrified. They feared that the governor was accusing them of theft, as they had discovered the money returned in their grain sacks after the first visit. They imagined it would be the end of them, but instead of confronting them about the money, Joseph treated them with hospitality, surprising them. He brought out Simeon, who had been held captive, and ordered his servants to wash his brothers' feet and feed their donkeys. When Joseph entered the room, the brothers bowed down before him, offering gifts and showing respect. Once again, Joseph's dream that his brothers would bow before him was coming true. But instead of rejoicing, Joseph felt the pain of the past mixed with love for his family. He asked about his father's well-being and was deeply moved to see Benjamin. However, to maintain his hidden identity, he left the room and wept in secret. After washing his face, he returned with a calm demeanor. During the meal, Joseph arranged his brothers according to their birth order, which left them astonished. How could this Egyptian governor know their exact birth order? Moreover, he served Benjamin a portion 5 times larger than the others, testing his brothers' reactions. They, however, showed no signs of jealousy or resentment, which indicated to Joseph that perhaps they had changed. The next day, Joseph prepared his final test. He ordered that his brothers' sacks be filled with grain once more, but this time, he instructed that his silver cup be hidden in Benjamin's sack. At dawn, the brothers set out, believing they had successfully completed their mission. But shortly after leaving the city, they were intercepted by Joseph's servants, who accused them of theft. Stunned, the brothers protested, saying they would never do such a thing, especially after finding the money returned during their last visit. But when the sacks were searched, the silver cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Desperate, they tore their clothes in mourning and returned to the city. their hearts heavy with the knowledge that if Benjamin were taken, it would be their father Jacob's undoing. Back in Joseph's presence, they fell to the ground before him, pleading for mercy. Judah, the brother who had promised to protect Benjamin, made an emotional appeal. He explained how Benjamin's well-being was directly tied to their father's life and offered himself to stay in Benjamin's place as a slave, so that the young man could return home. Judah said, "How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father." The long-awaited moment had arrived. Joseph, who had kept his identity hidden for so long, could no longer contain his emotions. The sacrifice Judah was willing to make for Benjamin and his genuine concern for their father's well-being touched Joseph's heart in a way he could no longer ignore. He finally saw that his brothers had changed, that repentance and love for their family had transformed their hearts. Joseph ordered all the Egyptians to leave the room, leaving only him and his brothers. Once they were alone, Joseph could no longer hold back. He began to weep so loudly that the Egyptians and even Pharaoh's household could hear him. The brothers, bewildered and afraid, did not know what to think. Why was this powerful Egyptian governor on the verge of tears? Then, with his voice choked with emotion, Joseph finally said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Those words struck his brothers like lightning. For a moment, they were paralyzed, unable to process what they were hearing. This man, whom they believed to be an Egyptian noble, was actually the brother they had sold into slavery so many years ago. Shock and fear gripped them. How would Joseph react now? They expected punishment, perhaps even vengeance. But Joseph, seeing the fear in his brother's eyes, quickly reassured them. "Come closer to me," he said. And when they did, Joseph revealed more details to prove his identity, reminding them of events only he could know. The brothers finally realized that the man before them was indeed Joseph, their long-lost brother. They were speechless, filled with shame and remorse. Sensing their feelings, Joseph said to them, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." With these words, Joseph revealed his deep understanding of the divine purpose behind everything that had happened. He was not there to seek revenge, but to save his family and fulfill God's plan. The suffering he had endured had a greater purpose, and now he clearly saw how God had turned evil into good. Joseph then asked his brothers to return quickly to Canaan and bring their father and the entire family to Egypt. He promised to take care of them, offering them the best of the land, the region of Goshen, where they could live safely during the remaining years of famine. The brothers, still stunned, began to understand that, against all odds, their family's story was being restored. After Joseph's emotional revelation, joy and relief began to replace the fear and guilt among his brothers. They finally understood that God's purpose had guided every step of Joseph's journey, turning betrayal into a blessing for the entire family. Joseph not only forgave them but also offered them a new life in Egypt, far from the famine that was ravaging Canaan. The brothers, still astonished, prepared to return to Canaan and bring the news to their father, Jacob. They left loaded with gifts, provisions, and the wagons sent by Pharaoh. During the journey, their minds were filled with conflicting thoughts. How would they tell Jacob that Joseph, the son he believed to be dead for so many years, was alive and now the most powerful man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh? When the brothers arrived in Canaan and told Jacob the truth, he was initially incredulous. The news that Joseph was alive and, moreover, ruled over Egypt seemed too good to be true. Jacob, who had lived for so many years with the pain of losing his beloved son, could hardly believe his son's words. But when he saw the wagons and the gifts sent by Joseph, his spirit revived. Jacob exclaimed, "Enough! My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." And so Jacob, now an old man, began the journey to Egypt, taking with him his entire family and all their belongings. They set out with hearts full of hope, leaving behind the land marked by famine. It was a large caravan, composed of his sons, grandchildren, servants, and flocks. Jacob was about to see again the son he thought he had lost forever. On the way to Egypt, they reached Beersheba, where Jacob offered sacrifices to God. The Lord appeared to him in a vision at night, saying, "Jacob, Jacob, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." These words from God brought peace to Jacob's heart. He knew he was not only reuniting with Joseph, but that God himself was guiding his family into a new chapter in their history. When the caravan arrived in Egypt, Joseph went to meet his father in Goshen. The reunion between Joseph and Jacob was heart-wrenching. After so many years, they embraced and wept together for a long time. Joseph, who had endured so much suffering and so many twists and turns, finally found comfort in his father's arms. Seeing Joseph in the flesh, Jacob said, "Now I can die in peace, for I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." Jacob's words were filled with gratitude and relief. He had witnessed great tragedy, but now he saw God's goodness manifest in his life. Joseph presented his father and his brothers to Pharaoh, who received Jacob with respect and kindness. Pharaoh offered Joseph's family the best part of the land of Egypt, the region of Goshen, where they could live in peace and prosperity. There, Jacob and his sons settled, protected by God's mighty hand and under Joseph's leadership. After the emotional reunion with his father, Joseph and his family began a new life in Egypt, in the region of Goshen, where they enjoyed the protection and blessings of Pharaoh. The famine continued to ravage the lands for another 5 years, but thanks to Joseph's wisdom, Egypt was prepared. While other nations struggled to survive, Jacob's family prospered, safe and well-fed. As time passed, Jacob, now advanced in age, felt that his days were coming to an end. He asked Joseph to come see him, bringing his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Jacob, moved to see not only Joseph but also his grandsons, decided to bless them. In a significant gesture, he crossed his hands, placing his right hand on Ephraim, the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh, the firstborn, reversing the traditional order of blessing. Joseph tried to correct his father, but Jacob insisted, saying, "I know, my son, I know. Manasseh will also become a people, and he will also be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations." With these words, Jacob granted a special blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh, symbolizing the bright future that awaited them. After blessing Joseph's sons, Jacob called all his sons together to give them his final blessing and prophesy about the future of their tribes. Each son received words that reflected his character and the destiny of his lineage. When it was Judah's turn, Jacob proclaimed that the scepter would not depart from his line, a prophecy pointing to the future King David and, eventually, to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would come from the tribe of Judah. After blessing his sons, Jacob made one last request: that he be buried in the land of Canaan with his ancestors in the cave of Machpelah, which Abraham had purchased. When he finished giving his instructions, Jacob drew his feet up into the bed and, surrounded by his sons, breathed his last in peace. The mourning for Jacob was profound. Joseph, with a heavy heart, ordered that his father be embalmed according to Egyptian customs, and Pharaoh granted permission for him to fulfill Jacob's final wish. A great procession was organized, including high-ranking Egyptian officials, and Jacob's sons carried his body back to Canaan, where they buried him with honors in the cave of Machpelah. After the burial, Joseph's brothers grew anxious. Now that their father was gone, they feared that Joseph might finally take revenge for what they had done to him in the past. They gathered and sent a message to Joseph, saying that before he died, Jacob asked that Joseph forgive their sins. They bowed before Joseph, offering themselves as his servants, fearing the worst. When Joseph heard this, he wept. He knew that his brothers still did not fully understand God's purpose. With tenderness and compassion, he said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." In this way, Joseph reaffirmed his forgiveness and eased his brothers' fears. Joseph lived out the rest of his days in Egypt, watching his children and grandchildren grow. Before he died, he made the sons of Israel swear that when God visited them to bring them back to the promised land, they would carry his bones with them. Joseph passed away at the age of 110, and his body was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, awaiting the day when the people of Israel would leave that land to fulfill God's promise. The story of Joseph teaches us about the power of forgiveness, the importance of trusting in God's plans, and how he can transform even the worst circumstances into blessings. Like Joseph, we all face challenges and moments of pain, but it is in God's hands that we find purpose and redemption. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment sharing what impacted you the most, or if you have experienced a situation where you saw God turn evil into good. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and share it with friends and family who need a message of hope and faith. Your participation is essential for us to continue spreading these stories of inspiration. God bless you.